At 3 a.m. on that fateful Tuesday morning, instead of chopping vegetables for 40 ungrateful relatives, I was sipping champagne at 35,000 feet, watching my daughter in law's carefully planned family gathering crumble into chaos from my airplane window. 4 years of being treated like hired help had led to this moment of sweet, calculated revenge. But what Melissa didn't know was that her cruelty had just cost her everything, including the roof over her head. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey of betrayal, liberation, and unexpected love. And don't forget to comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled across the world. The smell of burnt coffee and broken dreams filled the kitchen that Tuesday morning, but I wasn't there to witness it. No, by the time my daughter in law Melissa discovered my farewell letter propped against the empty fruit bowl, I was already somewhere over the Rocky Mountains ordering my second mimosa and feeling more alive than I had in 4 years. But let me back up and tell you how a 64-year-old widow from Chicago ended up staging the most spectacular family dinner escape in modern history. It all started on a gray October evening, exactly 96 hours before my great escape. I was in my usual spot, hunched over the kitchen sink, scrubbing the remnants of another elaborate meal I'd prepared for David and Melissa's dinner party. My arthritic hands ached as I worked the sponge around the corners of the expensive china they'd insisted I use, the same china that had been a wedding gift from my late husband Jack and me, now relegated to their everyday dinnerware. "Margaret," Melissa's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. She never called me Mom, despite 4 years of marriage to my son David. Always Margaret spoken, with just enough edge to remind me of my place in her perfectly curated world. I dried my hands on the dish towel, the same faded blue one Jack had brought me from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls 43 years ago, and turned to face her. Melissa stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her manicured fingers dancing across her phone screen, not bothering to look up. Even in her casual evening wear, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Everything about her was calculated perfection, from her highlighted blonde hair to her designer athleisure outfit that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. "I need you to cook for the family reunion this Saturday," she said, still not looking up. "We're expecting about 40 people. David's cousins are flying in from Denver, and my parents are driving up from Springfield. I've already told everyone you'd handle all the food." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "This Saturday, as in 5 days from now." 4 days, actually. I need you to start prep work on Thursday. The meat will need to marinate, and you know how long it takes you to get anything done these days. Finally, she glanced up, her ice blue eyes meeting mine with casual indifference. "You'll need to be up by 3 a.m. on Saturday to get everything ready. People start arriving at noon, and you know how cranky David gets when food isn't ready on time." The words hit me like a physical blow. 40 people, 3 a.m., 4 days' notice, and delivered with all the warmth of a weather report. "Melissa, I don't think—" "Margaret," she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "This isn't a discussion. Family is important, and everyone's expecting your famous pot roast and those little appetizers you made for Christmas. Besides, what else do you have to do?" What else did I have to do? The question echoed in my head as I stood there in the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours over the past 4 years cooking meal after meal for a family that treated me like staff. What else did I have to do besides the laundry, the cleaning, the babysitting, the grocery shopping, the lawn care, and the 100 other thankless tasks that filled my days? "I'll need help." I managed to say, my voice smaller than I'd intended. Melissa laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Help, Margaret? You raised 3 kids and ran a household for 40 years. I think you can handle one little family dinner. Besides, it'll give you something to keep busy with. I know how you get when you have too much time to think." Too much time to think. As if grief was a hobby I indulged in when I should be focusing on more productive activities. "Now I need the menu by tomorrow so I can post it on Facebook. Make sure you include options for the vegetarians. David's cousin Sarah has gotten very preachy about that lately." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Margaret, Try to use the good linens this time. The ones from Target make the table look cheap. The good linens, the ones Jack and I had received as a wedding present from his grandmother, the ones I'd carefully preserved through 4 decades of marriage, bringing them out only for the most special occasions. Now they were just another item on Melissa's list of requirements for impressing her extended family. I listened to the clicking of her heels as she walked away, each step echoing through the house that had once been my sanctuary and was now feeling more like a beautifully decorated prison. David was in his office, probably working late again, or maybe playing video games I learned not to ask. The kids, Emma and Jake, were upstairs doing homework, bless their hearts. At least they still hugged me goodnight and asked about my day. I stood alone in that kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of another evening spent serving others, and felt something shift inside me. It was subtle at first, like the moment when you realize a headache that's been building all day has finally arrived in full force. But this wasn't pain, it was clarity. I thought about Jack, about the man who had spent 40 years telling me I was the strongest woman he'd ever known. Jack, who had died 3 years ago after a sudden heart attack, leaving me not just widowed, but completely untethered from the life we'd built together. Jack, who had always said I was too generous for my own good, too willing to give everything I had to people who wouldn't do the same for me. The house we'd shared for 35 years had felt too empty, too full of memories that made me ache with loneliness. When David suggested I move in with his family, it had seemed like a godsend, a chance to be useful again, to be around family to help raise my grandchildren and ease the burden on my son and daughter-in-law as they navigated their busy careers. I'd sold my house, the house Jack and I had bought with our first mortgage, where we'd raised our 3 children, where we'd celebrated every holiday and anniversary. I'd sold it and given David and Melissa the money to pay off their mortgage, $200,000, that represented a lifetime of careful saving and responsible choices. Money that was supposed to buy me a place in their family, a role that mattered, a future that felt secure. Instead, it had bought me a bedroom in what felt increasingly like a servant's quarters and a daily routine that consisted of cooking, cleaning, and being reminded in 1,000 small ways that I was a burden they were graciously tolerating. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where Jack and I used to host barbecues every summer. David's family had removed the old apple tree we'd planted when he was 5, replacing it with a modern fire pit that they used maybe 3 times a year. Even the landscaping had been changed to something more contemporary, more suitable for the kind of entertaining Melissa preferred. That's when the idea began to form. It started as just a whisper in the back of my mind, a tiny voice that sounded suspiciously like Jack's. What would happen if you just didn't? What would happen if I didn't spend the next 4 days planning a menu for 40 people who barely acknowledged my existence? What would happen if I didn't set my alarm for 3 a.m. on Saturday morning? What would happen if for once in my life I chose myself? The voice grew louder as I finished cleaning the kitchen, as I wiped down the counters and loaded the dishwasher and turned off the lights. It followed me upstairs as I passed David's office, where I could hear him on a work call that was running late again. It whispered to me as I checked on Emma and Jake, both of whom barely looked up from their devices to say goodnight. By the time I reached my bedroom, the small guest room that had become my permanent residence, the whisper had become a roar. I sat on the edge of the bed Jack and I had shared for the last 5 years of our marriage, the one piece of furniture I'd been allowed to keep when I moved in. I pulled out the photo I kept on my nightstand, the one of Jack and me in Hawaii from our 35th wedding anniversary. We'd taken that trip on a whim, using money we probably should have saved. Jack had convinced me we deserved a little adventure, a little indulgence after decades of being responsible. Life's too short to always be practical, Maggie, he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to call me. Sometimes you have to do something crazy. I stared at that photo for a long time, remembering the woman I used to be. The woman who had laughed so hard at Jack's terrible jokes that wine came out her nose. The woman who had once driven through the night to surprise her sister in Kansas City just because she felt like being spontaneous. The woman who had raised 3 children and managed a household and still found energy to volunteer at the church and organize neighborhood block parties. Where had that woman gone? When had I become someone who accepted being ordered around in her own family? When had I become someone who said yes to everything and no to nothing, even when saying yes was slowly killing my spirit? I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the financial documents I kept there. The deed transfer that had given David and Melissa full ownership of their house, the bank statement showing the depleted savings account that had once represented Jack's and my security, the will that Jack had left, which I'd only glanced at because the grief had been too overwhelming to deal with the details. As I looked through the papers, my hands shaking slightly with something that felt like the beginning of rebellion, I noticed something I'd missed before. A letter from Jack's attorney dated just 2 weeks before his death referencing a trust that I knew nothing about. Something about additional assets that required a 30-day waiting period before they could be accessed. I'd been so consumed with grief, so overwhelmed by the immediate decisions that had to be made about the funeral and the house and where I would live, that I'd never followed up on this letter. I'd assumed it was just legal paperwork that didn't matter anymore, bureaucratic loose ends from a life that was over. But now, sitting in the quiet of my borrowed bedroom, listening to the sounds of a family that treated me like hired help, I wondered what Jack had been planning. What provisions had he made that I didn't know about? What had he been trying to tell me in those final weeks when he'd been acting strangely secretive, making phone calls? He wouldn't discuss spending long hours with the attorney handling affairs. He said weren't worth worrying me about. The next morning I woke before dawn, not because I had to, but because 4 years of cooking breakfast for a family that rarely thanked me had trained my body to wake at 5 a.m. whether I wanted to or not. I made my way to the kitchen, started the coffee, and began the familiar routine of preparing for a day that would be exactly like every other day. But as I stood there cracking eggs for the scrambled breakfast that David preferred and brewing the dark roast coffee that Melissa had to have every morning, that whisper from the night before returned, stronger now, more insistent. What would happen if you just didn't, morning mom? David appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for work, checking his phone as he poured coffee into the travel mug I'd given him last Christmas. He was 42 now, but in moments like this, he still looked like the little boy who used to help me make pancakes on Saturday mornings, standing on a step stool so he could reach the griddle. "Good morning, honey." I handed him his plate of eggs, the same breakfast I'd been making him for 42 years, first as his mother, now as his live-in cook. "Melissa told me about Saturday," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Sounds like it's going to be great. I appreciate you handling all the food. You know how stressed these big family things make me." I studied his face, looking for some sign of the considerate son who used to call me every Sunday when he lived in his first apartment, who used to ask my advice about everything from job interviews to whether he should propose to his college girlfriend. When had he stopped seeing me as a person with feelings and opinions and started seeing me as just another household convenience? "David," I said carefully, "it's a lot of work for one person. Maybe we could cater some of it or ask people to bring dishes to share." He finally looked up from his phone, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the old David, the one who cared about my well-being. But then his expression shifted back to the distracted politeness he'd been showing me for months. "Mom, you know how you get when other people cook in your kitchen. Remember last Christmas when Aunt Linda tried to help with the turkey? You redid everything she touched." He smiled the kind of smile people use when they're being patient with an eccentric elderly relative. "Besides, everyone's expecting your cooking. It wouldn't be the same if we brought in some generic catering. Everyone's expecting your cooking." As if my food was the only reason anyone would want to see me, as if I was valued only for what I could produce, not for who I was. "I just think, Mom." His tone was gentle but firm, the same tone he used with Emma and Jake when they were being unreasonable about bedtime. "It's going to be fine. You're great at this stuff. It's what you do. It's what you do, not it's something you're good at, or it's something you enjoy. It's what you do, like breathing or sleeping, something so automatic and expected that it didn't deserve gratitude or recognition. He kissed my forehead in that absent way that had replaced the real hugs he used to give me, grabbed his coffee and his briefcase, and headed for the door. "Love you, Mom. Thanks for taking care of everything." And then he was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen with the eggs getting cold on my own untouched plate. Melissa appeared 20 minutes later, looking effortlessly put together in a way that used to make me feel proud of my daughter-in-law and now just made me feel invisible. She poured herself coffee into one of the expensive mugs she'd bought to replace the mismatched collection Jack and I had accumulated over the years. "I've been thinking about Saturday," she said, not bothering with good morning pleasantries. "We should probably set up the buffet in the dining room instead of letting people crowd into the kitchen. It'll flow better for photos." Photos. Of course. The family reunion wasn't about bringing people together. It was about creating content for social media proof that Melissa was the kind of woman who could effortlessly host beautiful gatherings in her beautiful home. Also, I think we should use the china instead of paper plates. I know it's more cleanup for you, but presentation matters, especially with David's family. You know how his cousin Patricia is always trying to one-up everyone. More cleanup for me. Always for me. Never more cleanup for us, or we'll need to plan for extra dishwashing. The assumption that I would handle every aspect of the work was so ingrained that it didn't even occur to her to phrase it differently. "Melissa," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I've been thinking, maybe this year we could ask everyone to contribute something, make it more of a potluck situation." She looked at me like I'd suggested we serve dinner on paper towels. "A potluck, Margaret, this isn't some church social. This is a family reunion. People expect a certain standard when they come to our house. Our house. The house I'd paid for. Besides, you know how David's family is about food. Remember what happened when his sister tried to make that casserole for Easter? It was inedible, and my parents specifically asked if you were doing your famous pot roast. I already told them yes." She took a sip of her coffee, studying me over the rim of her mug. "Is this about money? Because if you need grocery money, just let me know. I can give you my Costco card." Money. She thought my reluctance was about money, as if the issue was the cost of feeding 40 people, and not the assumption that I would spend 4 days of my life in servitude to people who wouldn't notice if I disappeared tomorrow. "It's not about money," I said. "Then what's the problem? You love cooking for people. It's your thing. Your thing. Like a hobby or a quirk, something that defined me in their minds, but had nothing to do with my own desires or capacity or feelings about being taken for granted." I looked at Melissa, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had never had to consider what it felt like to be discarded to be useful, but not valued to be expected to be grateful for the privilege of being exploited. She was 38 years old, beautiful, successful in her own right, married to a man who adored her, living in a house she hadn't had to pay for, and it had never occurred to her to question whether the arrangement that benefited her so completely might not be equally beneficial for everyone involved. "You're right." I said the words coming out calm and measured in a way that surprised me. "It is my thing." She smiled the kind of bright, satisfied smile she gave when she'd successfully managed to get her way without having to actually argue for it. "Great. I'll send you the guest list so you know exactly how many people to plan for. And Margaret, maybe wear the blue dress on Saturday, the one from David's promotion party. It photographs well. It photographs well." Even my clothes were chosen based on how they would appear in her carefully curated social media posts. After she left for her yoga class, I stood alone in the kitchen again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like possibility. I walked to the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. "Thompson and Associates Attorney at Law." "This is Margaret Patterson. I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson about my husband's estate. I think there are some documents I need to review." The appointment was set for that afternoon. I spent the rest of the morning in a strange state of nervous energy, going through the motions of my daily routine while my mind raced with questions I'd been too grief-stricken to ask 3 years ago. Mr. Thompson's office was exactly as I remembered it from the day Jack and I had come in to update our wills 5 years before his death. The same dark wood paneling, the same leather chairs, the same smell of old books and expensive coffee. But I felt different sitting there smaller somehow, like I'd shrunk in the years since Jack's death in ways that weren't just physical. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Thompson said, settling behind his desk with a thick file folder. I was wondering when you'd call. I sent several letters in the months after Jack's passing, but I assumed you were dealing with other priorities. Other priorities, like grief, like selling my house, like trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been shattered by loss. I'm sorry, I said. I wasn't ready to deal with financial matters then, but I found one of your letters recently, and I think there are things about Jack's estate that I don't understand. Mr. Thompson opened the file and pulled out several documents. Your husband was a very careful planner, Mrs. Patterson. In the months before his death, he made some significant changes to his estate planning that he specifically requested I not discuss with you until after a 30-day period following his passing. 30 days. I'd been drowning in grief for 30 days, making decisions about funeral arrangements and what to do with a house that felt too empty to bear. Jack had been planning something during those final weeks, something he hadn't wanted me to know about until I'd had time to process the immediate aftermath of losing him. What kind of changes? Mr. Thompson smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he was about to deliver news I wasn't expecting. Well, to begin with, Jack set up a trust that activates only if certain conditions are met. The primary condition was that you maintain your independence, meaning not move in permanently with family members or sell your primary residence to support others for a minimum of 30 consecutive days. My heart stopped. I I sold my house. I moved in with my son. Yes, I'm aware. Jack anticipated that might happen. He was very concerned that your generous nature might lead you to sacrifice your own security for the sake of helping family members who might not have your best interests at heart. Jack had known. Somehow he'd known that I would give up everything to help David and Melissa, and he'd tried to protect me from my own generosity. The trust contained several assets that Jack accumulated without your knowledge over the final years of his life, a small investment account that grew substantially, a life insurance policy beyond the one you knew about, and he paused, consulting his notes, a condominium in Maui that he purchased as a surprise for your 40th anniversary. The room seemed to tilt. A condominium in Maui. He'd been planning to surprise you with an extended vacation, possibly even a permanent relocation if you enjoyed it. The condo is fully paid for, and according to the trust documents, it becomes yours if you can demonstrate 30 consecutive days of independent living. I stared at the documents he was sliding across the desk, trying to process what I was hearing. Jack had bought us a place in Hawaii. He'd been planning a future I'd never imagined, a retirement that involved more than just staying home and waiting for visits from children and grandchildren. How much? I whispered. The trust, I mean. Including the condo, the life insurance, and the investment account, approximately $1.2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been giving away our savings to help David and Melissa, Jack had been secretly building a fortune designed to ensure my independence, money that could buy me freedom, security, the ability to make my own choices about how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. But I don't qualify, I said, the reality crashing down on me. I sold my house. I've been living with David for 4 years. Mr. Thompson's smile widened. Actually, Mrs. Patterson, you might be surprised to learn that you do qualify. The 30-day period can begin at any time you choose to reestablish independent living. And according to the trust documents, even a temporary separation from dependence on family members can trigger the waiting period as long as it demonstrates a genuine intention to reclaim your autonomy. Temporary separation. A trip, for instance, A vacation where you're living independently, making your own decisions, demonstrating that you're capable of and interested in maintaining your own household. Jack was very specific about this. He wanted to make sure you had a way out if you ever needed one. I thought about Melissa's casual cruelty, about David's indifference about the family reunion where I was expected to work like staff while being treated like an inconvenience. I thought about Jack's voice the night before he died when he'd held my hand and told me to promise him I'd never let anyone make me feel small. What would I need to do? I asked. Leave, Mr. Thompson said simply. Pack a bag, book a trip, go somewhere where you can be yourself for 30 days. At the end of that period, if you choose to maintain your independence, the trust activates and the funds become available to you. You could buy a new house, travel live, however you want to live. I sat in that office for another hour reviewing documents and asking questions, but my mind was already made up. By the time I left, I had a plan that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, I sat at my computer and browsed flights to Hawaii. The condo Jack had bought was in a complex called Sunset Palms, overlooking a beach where we'd walked hand in hand during our anniversary trip. The photos showed a small but beautiful space with a lanai that faced the ocean, palm trees swaying in the breeze, the kind of peace Jack had always said he wanted for us in our golden years. I booked a flight for Saturday morning departure time, 6 a.m., the same Saturday morning when I was supposed to be waking up at 3 a.m. to begin cooking for 40 people who would spend the day taking photos of themselves eating food I'd prepared, posting social media updates about their wonderful family gathering, and never once acknowledging the woman who'd made it all possible. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of double life. On the surface, I went through the motions of preparing for the family reunion. I made shopping lists, planned menus, even went to the grocery store and filled 2 carts with everything I would need to feed 40 people. Melissa checked in periodically, making suggestions and adjustments, adding last-minute complications like appetizers that would take hours to prepare and special dietary restrictions I hadn't been informed about earlier. But underneath the surface, I was planning my escape with the methodical care of a bank robber. I researched the weather in Hawaii, packed a single suitcase with clothes suitable for tropical beaches, and wrote a letter that took me 7 drafts to get right. The letter was the hardest part. I wanted to be honest about how I felt without being cruel. I wanted to explain my decision without justifying it because Jack had taught me that sometimes the people who love you don't understand your choices, and that's okay, as long as you understand them yourself. On Friday night, I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and placed the letter on the kitchen counter where Melissa would be sure to find it when she came down to check on my progress. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in months, slept deeply and peacefully. Saturday morning came with the kind of clarity that only arrives when you finally made a decision you should have made long ago. I dressed quietly, grabbed my suitcase, and slipped out of the house that had never really felt like home. The taxi I'd called was waiting in the driveway, and as we pulled away from the curb, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 4 years, the intoxicating rush of choosing myself. At the airport, I ordered a mimosa before my flight and raised it in a silent toast to Jack wherever he was. Here's to crazy decisions, my love, I whispered. Thanks for giving me a way out. The flight to Hawaii was smooth, and by the time we landed in Maui, I was already feeling like a different person. The woman who had spent 4 years accepting disrespect and diminishing herself for the comfort of others felt like someone I used to know but had outgrown. I took another taxi to Sunset Palms and used the key Mr. Thompson had given me to open the door to the condo Jack had bought for our future. It was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. The lanai overlooked a stretch of beach where the waves rolled in with hypnotic regularity, and the trade winds carried the scent of plumeria and possibility. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle I found in the kitchen. Jack had thought of everything and settled into a chair on the lanai to watch the sunset. Somewhere in Chicago, I knew chaos was erupting. Melissa was discovering my letter, David was making frantic phone calls, and 40 relatives were showing up to find an empty kitchen and no explanation for why the woman they'd taken for granted wasn't there to serve them. I felt a moment of guilt, but it passed quickly. I'd spent 4 years being who they needed me to be. It was time to remember who I wanted to be. My phone rang just as the sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me why Jack had fallen in love with this place. David's name appeared on the screen and I let it go to voicemail. Then Melissa called and I ignored that too. The messages started piling up, but I didn't listen to them. Whatever chaos I'd left behind, whatever anger or confusion or inconvenience my absence was causing, it wasn't my responsibility to fix anymore. Instead, I sat on that lanai and watched the sunset, feeling the warm breeze on my face and listening to the sound of waves that had been rolling onto that beach long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. For the first time in 4 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, I raised my wine glass to the memory of the man who had loved me enough to give me an escape route even after death. The adventure was just beginning. The first 3 days in paradise felt like waking up from a 4-year coma. I'd forgotten what it was like to make decisions based on my own desires rather than someone else's expectations. Should I have coffee on the lanai or walk down to the beach cafe? Did I want to spend the morning reading or exploring the local shops? These simple choices felt revolutionary after years of having my schedule dictated by other people's needs. But paradise has a way of making you confront truths you've been avoiding, and by Tuesday evening, the weight of what I'd done began to settle in. I was sitting on the lanai, watching the waves catch the last light of day, when my phone buzzed with yet another call from David. I'd been ignoring them for 3 days, letting the messages pile up like unopened bills. But this time something made me answer. Mom. Thank God. Where are you? We've been worried sick. David's voice was strained, more frantic than I'd heard it since he was a teenager who'd missed curfew. I'm fine, honey. I'm safe. But where are you? Melissa found your letter, but it didn't explain anything. The whole family showed up on Saturday, and there was no food, no explanation. Cousin Patricia was asking questions, and I didn't know what to tell anyone. I closed my eyes, picturing the scene. 40 hungry relatives arriving at noon to find empty serving dishes and a note that probably sounded cryptic and cruel. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for David having to face his extended family's confusion and disappointment without understanding it himself. I'm taking some time away, I said carefully. I needed space to think. Think about what, Mom, if this is about Saturday, we could have figured something out. You should have talked to us instead of just disappearing. Should have talked to them. As if 4 years of being taken for granted hadn't been communication enough. As if my daily presence, my constant availability, my willingness to sacrifice my own needs hadn't been a clear message about how little my comfort mattered to anyone in that house. David, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Really asked and waited for a real answer. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, his voice smaller. Mom, you always seemed fine. You never said anything about being unhappy. I shouldn't have had to say anything. I shouldn't have had to beg to be treated like a person instead of hired help in my own family. That's not fair. We appreciate everything you do. You know that. Do I? When was the last time anyone thanked me for cooking dinner? When was the last time someone asked if I wanted help with the dishes? When was the last time anyone considered that I might have preferences about how I spend my time? I could hear him breathing on the other end, and I knew I was being harder on him than I'd ever been before. But 4 years of swallowed resentment had to go somewhere, and sitting in this beautiful place that Jack had chosen for us, I finally felt strong enough to speak my truth. I gave you and Melissa $200,000 to pay off your house. I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. I sold the home your father and I built together and moved in to help with your family. In return, I became invisible. Useful, but invisible. Mom, that's not... David, My voice cut through his protest with an authority I hadn't used since he was a child. I'm 64 years old, and I have never in my adult life put my own needs first. Not when I was raising you and your siblings, not when I was taking care of your father through his illness, and not in the 4 years since I moved into your house. I'm taking 30 days to remember who I am when I'm not serving someone else. 30 days, Mom. What about Emma and Jake? They've been asking where Grandma went. And what about them will survive my absence just fine. Children are resilient, and they have two capable parents to take care of them. Another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice had taken on the patient tone he used when he thought he was dealing with an unreasonable person. Okay, Mom, I get that you're upset, but running away isn't the solution. Come home and we'll talk about this. We'll figure out how to make things better. Make things better. The same phrase Melissa had used when she'd thrown away Jack's photographs because they didn't fit her decorating scheme, then promised to make it better by letting me keep one small picture in my bedroom. I'm not running away, David. I'm running towards something. There's a difference. What does that even mean? I looked out at the ocean, watching a pair of dolphins playing in the waves about 50 yards from shore. Jack had always said dolphins were good luck, a sign that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. It means I'm learning what it feels like to wake up in the morning and decide how to spend my day based on what would make me happy instead of what would make me useful. It means I'm remembering that I'm a person with desires and opinions and preferences, not just a collection of skills that exist for other people's convenience. This doesn't sound like you, Mom. Maybe that's the problem. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of finally saying things I'd been thinking for years. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I turned it off and set it aside. Whatever crisis my absence was causing in Chicago, it wasn't my crisis to solve anymore. The next morning, I woke to a knock on the condo door. For a moment, panic fluttered in my chest. Had they somehow tracked me down? But when I opened the door, I found a woman about my age with silver hair pulled back in a messy bun and eyes the color of sea glass. You must be Margaret, she said with a warm smile. I'm Helen Morrison. I live in the unit next door. Your husband asked me to keep an eye out for you when you arrived. My husband. Jack had been planning this escape route so carefully that he'd even arranged for me to have a friend waiting. How did you... Jack contacted me about 6 months before he passed. Said he was worried about you being too generous for your own good after he was gone, and that if you ever made it out here, you might need someone to talk to who understood what it was like to start over later in life. I invited her in for coffee, and as we sat on the lanai watching the morning light dance on the water, Helen told me her story. She'd been married for 38 years to a man who'd gradually convinced her that her opinions didn't matter, her friends were inconvenient, and her role was to make his life as comfortable as possible. After he died, she'd discovered he'd been having affairs for decades and had left most of his money to a woman half Helen's age. I came here with nothing but my social security and a burning desire to prove to myself that I could build a life that made me happy, she said. That was 8 years ago, and I've never regretted it for a single day. How did you do it? Start over, I mean. Helen laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. One day at a time, one choice at a time. The first choice was to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The second was to stop making decisions based on what other people expected from me. We spent the morning talking about everything and nothing books, travel, the peculiar freedom that comes with reaching an age where you stop caring what people think of your choices. It was the first real conversation I'd had in years, the kind where both people listen and respond and build on each other's thoughts instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Your husband was a smart man, Helen said as she prepared to leave. He knew you'd need time to decompress before you could see clearly. The first week is always the hardest because you keep waiting for someone to need you urgently enough to justify going back to your old life. She was right. I'd been unconsciously listening for my phone, expecting some crisis that would require my immediate return to Chicago, Emma's school project, Jake's soccer tournament, David's work stress, Melissa's social obligations, some emergency that would prove I was indispensable after all. But the days passed without any genuine emergencies, only the ordinary challenges of daily life that somehow got handled without my intervention. The world, it seemed, could function perfectly well without my constant availability. By the end of my first week in Hawaii, I'd established a routine that felt both foreign and natural. I woke when my body wanted to wake, not when an alarm demanded it. I walked on the beach every morning, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours, depending on my mood and what I discovered along the way. I read books I'd been meaning to read for years, cooked simple meals that pleased only me, and spent long hours on the lanai just watching the ocean and remembering what it felt like to be still. The phone calls from Chicago became less frequent but more desperate. Melissa left increasingly frantic voicemails about how my absence was affecting the children, how David was stressed about work and needed my support, how the house felt chaotic without my organizing presence. The guilt was expertly applied, each message designed to remind me of my obligations and the ways my selfishness was damaging the people I was supposed to love. But distance has a way of providing perspective, and from 3,000 miles away, I could see the manipulation more clearly. The children were fine, in fact, according to the cheerful phone calls I had with Emma and Jake. When I called them directly, they were enjoying having more one-on-one time with their parents. David's work stress was nothing new and nothing that required my management. The house felt chaotic because for 4 years I'd been the one maintaining order, and no one had bothered to learn how to do it themselves. It was during my second week that I met Jim. I'd been sitting at a beachside cafe reading a novel and enjoying a leisurely lunch when a man at the next table struck up a conversation about the book I was reading. He was probably in his late 60s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from spending time outdoors and the easy confidence of someone who's comfortable in his own skin. Excellent choice, he said, nodding toward my copy of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. My book club just finished that one. Fascinating discussion about reinvention and the costs of living for other people's expectations. I looked up, surprised. In my experience, men rarely noticed what women were reading, much less wanted to discuss it. You're in a book club. He laughed, a warm sound that made me realize how long it had been since I'd heard genuine male laughter that wasn't tinged with impatience or condescension. Retired English teacher. Old habits die hard. Plus, it's a great way to meet interesting people who like to think about big questions. We talked for almost 2 hours. Jim had been widowed 3 years earlier, had grown children on the mainland who visited occasionally but had built their own lives, and had moved to Hawaii because he'd always dreamed of living somewhere he could swim in the ocean every day. He was intelligent, funny, and most remarkably genuinely interested in what I had to say. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you visiting or have you escaped here permanently?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, and realized it was the first completely honest answer I'd given anyone about my situation. "I'm taking some time to figure out what I want my life to look like." "That's brave," he said simply, and something in his tone told me he understood exactly what kind of courage it took to upend a life that looked stable from the outside. We made plans to meet for dinner the next evening, and as I walked back to the condo, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: anticipation about spending time with someone who saw me as interesting rather than useful. The dinner was even better than the lunch. Jim was well-traveled, well-read, and had the kind of curiosity about the world that made every conversation feel like an adventure. But more than that, he treated me like someone worth listening to, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered, someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed rather than simply tolerated. "Tell me about your life before Hawaii," he said over dessert. I found myself giving him the real story, not the sanitized version I usually told about being grateful for the chance to help my family, but the honest truth about feeling invisible and taken for granted, about losing myself in the role of perpetual caregiver, about the desperate escape that had brought me to this island. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize my experience, without suggesting that I should be more understanding of my family's perspective. "It sounds like you gave everything you had until there was nothing left," he said when I finished. "That's not generosity, that's self-destruction." No one had ever put it so clearly before, but he was absolutely right. I'd confused martyrdom with love depletion with devotion. I'd given until I was empty and then felt guilty for having nothing left to give. "The question is," Jim continued, "what do you want to build in the space you've created by leaving?" It was a question I wasn't ready to answer yet, but I was grateful that someone was finally asking it. What did I want? Not what did my family need from me? Not what would be the responsible thing to do? Not what would make other people happy? What did Margaret Patterson want for herself? That night, I called Mr. Thompson to check on the trust requirements. I'd been in Hawaii for 2 weeks, and I wanted to make sure I was meeting all the conditions for accessing the funds Jack had left for me. "You're doing perfectly, Mrs. Patterson," he assured me. "The trust specifies that you need to demonstrate 30 consecutive days of independent living, making your own decisions about where to live and how to spend your time. Your hotel bills and activity receipts show exactly the kind of self-directed lifestyle Jack intended. What happens after the 30 days? The funds become available to you immediately. You can choose to return to your previous living arrangement, but the money ensures you'll never be dependent on anyone else's generosity again. Or you can use it to build whatever life you want, wherever you want to build it." Whatever life I wanted. The phrase echoed in my mind as I hung up the phone. For 64 years, I'd lived the life other people wanted me to live, first as the dutiful daughter, then the devoted wife, then the helpful mother-in-law. I'd never seriously considered what my own desires might be independent of everyone else's needs. My 3rd week in Hawaii brought both clarity and crisis. The clarity came from the growing certainty that I didn't want to go back to being invisible in Chicago. I was happier, healthier, and more alive than I'd been in years. I was sleeping better, laughing more, and rediscovering parts of my personality that had been buried under years of obligation and resentment. The crisis came in the form of David showing up at my door. I was getting ready for another dinner with Jim when I heard the familiar knock, not Helen's cheerful tap, but the authoritative pounding that meant someone was upset and expected immediate attention. When I opened the door, David stood there looking haggard and frustrated, still in the business clothes he'd presumably worn on the plane from Chicago. "Mom, we need to talk." He pushed past me into the condo without being invited, looking around with the kind of critical assessment that told me he was already judging my choices. "This is what you gave up your family for a rental apartment on some beach." "I didn't give up my family, David. I gave up being treated like hired help by my family. There's a difference." And he turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before, desperation mixed with genuine anger. "Do you have any idea what chaos you've caused? Melissa's been crying for 3 weeks. The kids keep asking when you're coming home. I've had to take time off work to handle things you usually take care of. The house is a disaster. We're eating takeout every night, and everyone thinks we did something terrible to drive you away." "Maybe that's because you did do something terrible." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. David stared at me like I'd slapped him. "What are we talking about, Mom? We gave you a place to live, included you in our family, made you part of everything we do. You gave me a place to serve you. You included me in your family as unpaid staff. You made me part of everything you do because you needed someone to do the work you didn't want to do yourselves. That's not how it was. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked what I wanted to do on a weekend before you made plans that required my babysitting? When was the last time you considered that I might not want to host another dinner party or clean up after another gathering? When was the last time anyone in your house treated me like a person with preferences instead of a resource to be managed?" David sat down heavily on the couch, running his hands through his hair, in the gesture he'd used since childhood when he was overwhelmed. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to come to me with problems too big for him to solve alone. I didn't realize you felt that way. I know you didn't. That's part of the problem. We sat in silence for several minutes, the sound of waves outside providing a soundtrack to one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had with my son. What do you want from me, Mom? An apology, changes in how we do things. Just tell me what you need and I'll make it happen. What did I need? The question was harder to answer than it should have been because for so long my needs had been irrelevant to every decision I made. I need you to see me as a person, not just as your mother. I need my contributions to be appreciated, not expected. I need to be consulted about decisions that affect my time and energy. I need to feel like I matter for who I am, not just for what I can do for other people. Okay, yes, we can do that. But even as he said it, I could see that he didn't really understand. He was looking for a quick fix, a set of behavioral changes that would get me back to Chicago and restore the status quo. He wasn't grasping that the problem wasn't just how I'd been treated, but how I'd allowed myself to be treated, how I'd lost myself in the process of trying to be indispensable to people who had learned to take my indispensability for granted. David, I appreciate that you want to make changes, but I'm not ready to come back yet. I'm still figuring things out. How long do you need? I don't know. His frustration was palpable. Mom, this isn't fair to any of us. You can't just disappear and leave us to figure everything out on our own. Why not? You're all adults. You figured out how to live before I moved in with you. That was different. We were younger, then we had more energy, and we didn't have kids. You had Emma when I moved in. You managed to take care of one child without my help. What changed when Jake came along that made you suddenly unable to function without a live-in caregiver? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see David struggling with the implication. What had changed was that they'd gotten comfortable with having someone else handle the inconvenient parts of family life. Comfortable enough that they'd stopped noticing how much work I was doing or how little appreciation I was receiving. Look, David said finally, maybe we took you for granted sometimes. Maybe we should have been more grateful. But that doesn't mean you should abandon your family to live in some fantasy tropical paradise. Fantasy tropical paradise. He made it sound like a delusion, a frivolous escape from reality, instead of the first place I'd felt truly peaceful in years. What if it's not a fantasy, David? What if this is where I want to live? You can't be serious. Why can't I be? I'm 64 years old, and for the first time in decades, I'm making decisions based on what makes me happy instead of what makes me useful. I'm meeting new people, discovering new interests, building a life that belongs to me. Why is that less valid than spending my remaining years cooking meals for people who don't thank me and cleaning up after people who don't notice? David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the ocean with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a complex problem. What about the kids, Mom? What about Emma and Jake? Don't they deserve to have their grandmother in their lives? The guilt card. I'd been expecting it, but it still hit hard. My grandchildren were the purest joy in my life, the one relationship in that house that felt uncomplicated and genuine. They do deserve that, I said quietly. But they also deserve to have a grandmother who's happy and fulfilled, not one who's bitter and resentful because she never learned to take care of herself. I can love them from here, David. I can visit, they can visit me, but I don't have to sacrifice my own well-being to prove how much I care about them. This is insane. You're talking about throwing away your entire life for what some old guy you met at the beach. I stared at him, shocked by the venom in his voice. How did you? I hired a private investigator, Mom. I know about Jim Morrison. I know about your cozy little dinners and your walks on the beach. Is this what Dad would have wanted? His widow running off to play house with some stranger? The cruelty of the accusation took my breath away. that David would use his father's memory as a weapon, that he would reduce my tentative steps toward happiness to something sordid and shameful, revealed a depth of selfishness I hadn't realized he possessed. Your father, I said, my voice deadly calm, bought me this condo. He set up a trust to ensure I'd have the means to be independent if I ever needed to be. He planned this escape route because he knew me well enough to worry that I'd give everything away and leave nothing for myself. He would have wanted me to be happy, David, even if my happiness inconvenienced you. David went very still. What are you talking about? What trust? And that's when I realized that David had no idea about the financial provisions Jack had made for me. He'd assumed I was living on Social Security and the small savings account we'd shared, that I was as dependent on his generosity as he'd believed. The idea that I might have independent means, that I might not need his charity, had never occurred to him. I told him about the trust, about the money, about the condo, and the conditions Jack had set for accessing the funds. I watched his face change as he processed the implications, that I wasn't some helpless widow dependent on his tolerance, but a woman with options who was choosing not to exercise them in his favor. So this whole thing was planned, he said finally. Dad set this up to break apart our family. Your father set this up to make sure I'd never be trapped by my own generosity. The fact that you see my independence as a threat to your family says more about your family than it does about Dad's intentions. David left that evening without saying goodbye, catching a red-eye back to Chicago that would get him home in time for whatever crisis he was certain was waiting for him. I didn't try to stop him or smooth over the harsh words we'd exchanged. Some conversations can't be unsaid, and maybe that was for the best. But as I sat on the lanai that night, watching the stars reflect in the ocean and thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. The confrontation with David had forced me to articulate things I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to name. I wasn't running away from my family. I was running toward myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jim. Hope your evening went better than expected. Coffee tomorrow if you feel like company. I smiled, typing back, would love that. I have a lot to tell you. For the first time since I'd arrived in Hawaii, I was beginning to understand what Jack had known all along. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the courage to become the person you were meant to be, even if they can't see it as a gift at the time. The waves continued their eternal rhythm outside my window, and I fell asleep to the sound of possibility washing up on the shore of my new life. The morning after David's visit dawned gray and stormy, the first overcast day I'd experienced since arriving in Hawaii. The weather seemed to mirror my emotional state as I sat with my coffee, replaying every word of our confrontation. The hurt in David's eyes when I told him about the trust haunted me, but so did the casual cruelty with which he dismissed my happiness as a betrayal of his father's memory. Jim found me on the beach around 10 o'clock, walking aimlessly in the drizzle, with tears I couldn't seem to stop mixing with the rain on my cheeks. Rough night, he asked gently, falling into step beside me without asking permission or demanding explanations. My son came to visit. It didn't go well. Want to talk about it? I found myself telling him everything: David's anger, his accusations about our friendship, the way he'd made my independence sound like selfishness and my happiness sound like betrayal. Jim listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding that let me know he was truly hearing what I was saying. He's scared, Jim said when I finished, scared that if you don't need him, you won't love him. It's a common confusion, especially among people who've been trained to believe that love is transactional. What do you mean? Think about it. For 4 years, you've shown your love through service, cooking, cleaning, babysitting, organizing their lives. From his perspective, that service was how you expressed caring. Now you've stopped serving, so in his mind you've stopped caring. We'd reached a small cove where the waves were calmer, and Jim guided me to a piece of driftwood that made a natural bench. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low and heavy, making the whole world feel hushed and contemplative. I do love him, I said. I love all of them, but I can't keep destroying myself to prove it. Of course you can't. But David doesn't understand that yet because he's never had to choose between serving others and serving himself. He's been the recipient of unconditional service his whole life, first from you as his mother, now from you as his live-in caregiver. The idea that service might have limits, that the person providing it might have needs of their own, is foreign to him. Jim's insight was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it helped me understand that David's reaction came from fear rather than malice. Disturbing because it suggested that I'd played a role in teaching him to take my sacrifices for granted. How do I fix that, though? You don't, Jim said gently. That's his work to do, not yours. Your work is to figure out who you are when you're not responsible for managing everyone else's emotional well-being. Over the next few days, the fallout from David's visit intensified. The phone calls from Chicago became more frequent and more frantic. Melissa left voicemails that swung wildly between manipulation and rage, sometimes within the same message. Margaret, I don't know what David said to you, but you can't take it seriously. He's under so much stress right now, he's not thinking clearly. We need you here. The children need their grandmother, not some vacation fantasy you're living out there. Then in the same message, this is incredibly selfish, you know. We opened our home to you, treated you like family, and this is how you repay us, by abandoning us when we need you most. I stopped listening to the voicemails after the third day. Whatever guilt or obligation they were trying to invoke, I was beginning to recognize it as emotional manipulation rather than legitimate concern for my well-being. Instead, I focused on the daily rhythms I'd established in my new life. Morning walks on the beach, often with Helen, who had become not just a neighbor, but a genuine friend. Afternoons spent reading or exploring the island, discovering hidden beaches and local markets and small towns that felt like secrets the mainland tourists never found. Evenings with Jim talking about books or politics or philosophy or simply watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that never got old. It was during one of these conversations with Jim that I began to understand the full scope of what Jack had planned for me. We were sitting on my lanai sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky when Jim asked about my long-term plans. I don't know, I admitted. The trust money becomes available next week after I've been here for 30 days. Part of me wants to stay, but part of me feels guilty about abandoning my family permanently. What does staying look like? Jim asked. Practically speaking, I'd been avoiding that question because it felt too presumptuous, too much like counting chickens before they hatched. But sitting there with this kind, intelligent man who'd shown me what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than what I could do, I found myself painting a picture of a life I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I could buy a place here, something small but mine, maybe get involved in local volunteer work, not because someone needs me to, but because I want to contribute to a community I'm choosing to be part of. I could travel, see places Jack and I always talked about visiting, but never had the time or money to explore. I could learn new things, pottery or painting, or maybe take some classes at the community college. That sounds wonderful. But what about Emma and Jake? What about David? How can I be happy when my choices are hurting people I love? Jim was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass and watching the liquid catch the light from the tiki torches I'd lit on the lanai. Margaret, can I tell you about my daughter Sarah? I nodded, realizing that despite all our conversations, Jim had rarely talked about his own children. Sarah's 38, brilliant, successful architect living in Seattle. For years after her mother died, she kept trying to convince me to move up there closer to her and her family. She found assisted living facilities she thought I'd like, researched neighborhoods where I could buy a house near theirs, sent me articles about the cultural activities available for seniors in the Pacific Northwest. She sounds like she cares about you. She does. But she was also terrified that if I stayed in Sacramento, where my wife and I had lived for 30 years, I'd become a sad, lonely old man who withered away from grief and isolation. Her solution was to transplant me into her life, where she could monitor my well being and make sure I was staying active and social and properly cared for. I could see where this was going, and it made me uncomfortable because it hit so close to home. The problem was she was planning a life for me based on what would make her feel better about my well being, not on what would actually make me happy. When I told her I was moving to Hawaii instead, she was devastated, accused me of being selfish, of choosing strangers over family, of abandoning my grandchildren who barely knew their grandfather anyway. How did you handle that? I moved to Hawaii anyway. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, disappointing a child I love in order to choose a life that felt authentic to me. But you know what happened? What? After the initial anger and hurt, Sarah started to see me differently. Instead of the grief-stricken widower who needed managing, I became this adventurous guy who'd made a bold choice to rebuild his life. She started visiting regularly, bringing the kids exploring the island with me. Our relationship got stronger because it became voluntary instead of obligatory. She stopped worrying about me because I was obviously thriving, and I stopped resenting her because she wasn't trying to control my choices anymore. The parallel was so obvious it made my chest ache. You're saying I should stay. I'm saying you should choose what makes you happy and trust that the people who really love you will find a way to be okay with that choice, even if it takes them some time to get there. That night, I called Emma and Jake directly, something I'd been doing once or twice a week since arriving in Hawaii. Their voices always lifted my spirits. They were excited to hear about the beaches and the dolphins and the tropical flowers I'd been sending them pictures of, full of questions about island life and stories about their own adventures at school and with friends. "Grandma, when are you coming home?" Emma asked, as she had during every call. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart. I'm still figuring some things out." "Are you figuring out if you like living near the ocean?" "Among other things, yes." "Well, I think you should live wherever makes you happy," she said with the casual wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Mom says you're being selfish, but Dad says sometimes grown-ups need time to think about big decisions." Out of the mouths of babes, even David in his confusion and anger had apparently defended my right to time and space for reflection. Maybe there was hope for our relationship after all. "What do you think, Emma?" "I think I miss you a lot, but I also think you sound happier on the phone than you used to sound when you lived here. You laugh more now." Her observation hit me like a revelation. I did laugh more, I smiled more, I felt lighter and more energetic and more genuinely interested in the world around me than I had in years. The constant low-grade anxiety that had become my baseline emotional state in Chicago, the perpetual worry about what needed to be done, who needed taking care of, whether I was meeting everyone's expectations, had evaporated in the Hawaiian sunshine. "I love you, Grandma," Jake chimed in, not to be outdone by his sister's philosophical insights. "And I want you to be happy, even if happy means far away." After I hung up, I sat on the lanai and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and accepted by the two people whose opinions mattered most to me. My grandchildren, in their innocent clarity, had given me permission I hadn't realized I needed. The next morning brought news that changed everything. I was making breakfast when my phone rang with a call from an unknown Chicago number. Thinking it might be important, I answered to find a woman I didn't recognize speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Carol Hendricks. I work with your son David at Morrison Technologies. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I thought you should know what's happening here." My stomach clenched with immediate worry. "Is David okay? Is he hurt?" "He's not hurt, but—" "Mrs. Patterson, there's been some trouble at work. David's been under investigation for financial irregularities in his department. Nothing criminal, but serious enough that he's been placed on administrative leave while the company conducts a full audit." The words didn't make sense at first. David was one of the most ethical people I knew, meticulous about following rules and procedures to the point of obsessiveness. I don't understand. What kind of irregularities? I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but David's been a friend for years, and I know how much he's been struggling since you left. It looks like he's been using company credit cards for personal expenses. Nothing huge, but consistent charges for things like grocery delivery services, housekeeping, childcare. When questioned about it, he claimed they were work-related expenses, but the documentation doesn't support that. My heart sank as I began to understand. David had been using work resources to pay for the services I'd been providing for free, trying to replace my contributions to his household without having to admit how much he'd been relying on my unpaid labor. How much trouble is he in? If he can pay back what he owes and accept a formal reprimand, he'll probably keep his job. But we're talking about several $1,000s over the past month, and his explanation for why he needed these services suddenly doesn't make him look very good to management. After Carol hung up, I sat staring at my phone trying to process this new information. David's desperate attempts to maintain his household without me had led him to make choices that jeopardized his career. The responsible thing to do would be to fly back to Chicago immediately to help him through this crisis and restore the stability he'd apparently lost without my presence. But for the first time in my adult life, I found myself asking a different question. Was David's crisis really my emergency? He was a 42-year-old man with a college degree, a successful career, and a wife who was perfectly capable of contributing to their household management. The fact that he'd chosen to commit minor fraud rather than hire legitimate help or ask his family to pitch in revealed something about his character and his priorities that had nothing to do with my absence and everything to do with his unwillingness to adapt to changed circumstances. I called Mr. Thompson to confirm that my 30 days would be complete the following Tuesday and that the trust funds would be available immediately afterward. Then I called the airline and canceled the return ticket to Chicago I'd been holding as a safety net since my arrival. That afternoon, I met with a local real estate agent. Helen had recommended and looked at 3 condominiums for sale in my complex, one of them a corner unit with an expanded lanai and a view that included both the ocean and the mountains, felt like home the moment I walked through the door. I'd like to make an offer, I told the agent. Don't you want to think about it? Discuss it with your family. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, I said, and my family will adjust to whatever decision I make. The offer was accepted that evening, contingent on my securing financing within 10 days. The timeline was tight, but Mr. Thompson assured me that with the trust funds, obtaining a mortgage would be straightforward. I called Jim to share the news, and the joy in his voice made me realize that somewhere along the way, he'd become invested in my staying too. This calls for a celebration, he said. Dinner at that place overlooking Haleakala, the one with the sunset view. I'd love that. As I got dressed for dinner, choosing a sundress I'd bought in a local boutique, something colorful and flowing that I never would have worn in Chicago, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My skin had a golden glow from weeks of sunshine and ocean air. My hair, which I'd been coloring dark brown for years to look professional, had grown out to reveal natural silver threads that looked distinguished rather than aging in the tropical light. But most of all, my face looked different, relaxed, peaceful, genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with making other people comfortable. Dinner with Jim was magical. We talked about books and travel and the volunteer work we both wanted to pursue. We made plans to explore other islands together, to take a cooking class that focused on local cuisine, to join the community theater group that Helen had been raving about. Are you nervous about making such a big change? Jim asked over dessert. Terrified, I admitted, but also more excited than I've been in years. For the first time in my adult life, I'm making choices based on what will make me happy instead of what will make me useful. That's the most attractive thing about you, Jim said, reaching across the table to take my hand. the way you're discovering who you are when you're not taking care of everyone else." The contact was gentle, respectful, but it sent a warm flutter through my chest that reminded me I was still a woman with desires and needs of my own, not just a mother and grandmother and caregiver. "Jim, I need you to know that I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I've spent too many years being dependent on other people's goodwill." "I wouldn't want to take care of you," he said with a smile. "I want to build something with you. There's a difference." 3 days later, the crisis in Chicago exploded into full-scale drama when Melissa showed up at my door unannounced. I was working in the small garden I'd started on my lanai, planting herbs and flowering vines that thrived in the tropical climate, when I heard the familiar demanding knock that meant someone was upset and expected immediate attention. But when I opened the door, instead of finding David's frustrated expression, I found Melissa looking like she'd been through a tornado. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her designer clothes wrinkled as if she'd been wearing them for days. Most shocking of all, she'd been crying something I'd never seen in 4 years of living under the same roof. "Melissa, what are you doing here? Where are the children?" "They're with my parents in Springfield," she said, pushing past me into the condo with the same entitlement David had shown the week before. But where David had seemed angry and betrayed Melissa, just looked desperate. "David didn't tell you I was coming because he doesn't know. He thinks I'm at a spa weekend with my sister." She collapsed onto my couch, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable rather than perfectly composed. "Melissa, what's wrong? What's happened?" "Everything's falling apart, Margaret. Everything. David's in trouble at work. The house is a disaster. I can't keep up with everything that needs to be done, and the kids are acting out because they miss you and don't understand why you left." I handed her a glass of water and settled into the chair across from her, maintaining some distance while trying to process this dramatic change in the woman who'd been treating me like hired help for 4 years. "I heard about David's situation at work." "Then you know he could lose his job. Do you know why he was charging personal expenses to the company card? Because I couldn't handle everything by myself, and he was too proud to admit that we needed help. So we hired services to replace all the things you used to do, and it was costing us a fortune, and David panicked and made some really stupid decisions about how to pay for it all." The admission hung in the air between us that my contributions to their household had been valuable enough that replacing them had created a financial crisis, but not valuable enough for anyone to appreciate them while I was providing them for free. "Why are you here, Melissa?" "To ask you to come home, to apologize for not appreciating what you did for us, to beg you not to abandon your family when we need you most." It was the first time she'd ever apologized to me for anything, and I could see that it was costing her considerable effort to swallow her pride enough to make the request. "What's changed?" I asked gently. "A month ago, you were ordering me to cook for 40 people with 4 days' notice, throwing away my husband's photographs because they didn't fit your decorating scheme, and treating me like I was lucky to have a roof over my head. Now you're here asking me to come back. What's different?" Melissa's composure cracked completely, and she began sobbing with the kind of exhausted desperation that comes from weeks of trying to hold everything together and failing. "I didn't realize," she gasped between sobs, "I didn't realize how much you were doing, how much we were depending on you. I thought, I thought you were just helping out because you wanted to feel useful. I didn't understand that you were basically running our entire household while David and I focused on our careers. And now I'm trying to work full-time, manage 2 kids' schedules, keep the house clean, plan meals, do grocery shopping, coordinate carpools, and handle all the dozens of little things that just happen magically when you were there. I'm exhausted all the time, David's stressed about work, and no help at home. The kids are confused and acting out, and I feel like I'm drowning." The picture she painted was grimly familiar. It was exactly how I'd felt for the past 4 years, except that I'd been doing it all without a salary or benefits or recognition or appreciation. The difference was that Melissa was experiencing it as an emergency, while I'd been expected to handle it as my normal daily routine. "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, and I meant it. "But Melissa, what you're describing is the life I was living for 4 years, while being treated like it was my obligation rather than my contribution. I know that now. I see it now. And I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm genuinely deeply sorry for taking you for granted and treating you like staff instead of family." The apology was more than I'd ever expected to receive, but it also raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. Did her recognition of my value come from genuine appreciation or from desperation at finding herself in the position I'd occupied for so long? Would she revert to taking me for granted once the immediate crisis passed? "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come home. Help us get through this rough patch. We'll pay you this time a real salary for all the work you do. We'll give you more space, more appreciation, more say in how things are handled. Just please don't let our family fall apart because I was too stupid to see what we had." A real salary. After 4 years of unpaid labor, she was finally offering to compensate me for work she'd previously considered my duty as a family member. It should have felt like progress, but instead it felt like confirmation that they'd understood my worth all along, but had chosen not to acknowledge it until circumstances forced their hand. "I appreciate the apology, Melissa, and the offer, but I don't think coming back to Chicago is what's best for any of us right now." "Why not?" "We're offering to make changes to treat you better. Isn't that what you wanted?" 4 weeks ago, yes, but I've learned some things about myself since then. I've remembered what it feels like to make choices based on my own happiness instead of everyone else's convenience. I've discovered that I like the person I am when I'm not constantly serving other people's needs. Melissa stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "But what about family? What about the people who love you and need you?" "I love my family. I will always love my family, but I don't have to sacrifice my own well-being to prove that love." "And you don't actually need me, Melissa. You need help. There's a difference." "I don't understand." I walked to the window and looked out at the ocean where dolphins were playing in the waves about 100 yards from shore. Jack had always said dolphins were good luck, a sign that you were exactly where you belonged. If you need help managing your household, hire a housekeeper. If you need help with childcare, hire a nanny or find a good daycare program. If you need help with meal planning and cooking, hire a meal service or learn to cook simple, healthy meals yourselves. There are solutions to all of your problems that don't require me to give up my own life and happiness. "But we want you. We want family helping us, not strangers." "Then ask family to help you. Ask David's brothers and sisters to take turns watching the kids on weekends. Ask your parents to come stay for a few weeks while David deals with his work situation. Ask your friends to help with carpools and meal trains. Build a support network that doesn't depend on one person sacrificing everything to keep everyone else comfortable." Melissa was quiet for a long time, processing what I was saying. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "What if we can't figure it out without you? Then you'll learn to figure it out with me at a distance. You'll hire the help you need, you'll ask for support from people who choose to give it, and you'll adapt to managing your own lives instead of depending on someone else to manage them for you." "And what about Emma and Jake? What about David? Do they just have to accept that their grandmother and mother has chosen strangers over family?" The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable, framing my choice as abandonment rather than self-care, positioning my happiness as a betrayal of family loyalty. A month ago, it might have worked, but sitting in this beautiful place that Jack had chosen for our future, with the sound of waves providing a soundtrack to the most important conversation of my life, I felt strong enough to resist the guilt. They have to accept that their grandmother and mother is a person with her own needs and desires, not just a resource that exists for their convenience. And maybe that will teach them something valuable about building relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Melissa stayed for 2 more days, and during that time we had several more conversations that were painful but necessary. She told me about the chaos at home, about David's depression and anxiety about her own exhaustion and resentment at having to suddenly manage responsibilities she'd never had to think about before. But she also listened as I told her about my life in Hawaii, about the friends I was making and the activities I was exploring, and the sense of peace I'd found in making choices based on my own preferences rather than everyone else's expectations. Gradually, I could see her beginning to understand that my decision wasn't about rejecting my family, but about reclaiming myself. On her last morning, as we sat on the lanai sharing coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Melissa made one final attempt to change my mind. I still don't understand how you can be happy so far away from the people who love you. I'm not far away from the people who love me, I said gently. I'm far away from the people who need me to be someone other than who I am in order to love me. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, and I thought I saw the beginning of understanding in her expression. Will you visit? Will you come back for holidays and special occasions? I'll visit when I want to visit, not when I'm expected to visit. And I'll come as a guest who's invited and appreciated, not as unpaid help who's taken for granted. What about Emma and Jake? They can visit me here. I want them to see this place that makes me happy, to understand that their grandmother is a person with her own life and interests and adventures. Maybe it will teach them something about following their own dreams when they're adults. As Melissa's taxi pulled away that afternoon, taking her back to the airport, and the life she'd have to learn to manage without my constant support, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the pain my choices were causing people I loved, relief that I'd finally found the strength to choose myself even when that choice disappointed others. That evening, Jim and I walked on the beach and talked about the conversations I'd had with Melissa, about the guilt and uncertainty that still lingered despite my growing certainty that staying in Hawaii was the right choice for me. Do you think I'm being selfish? I asked him. I think you're being healthy, he said. There's a difference between selfishness, which disregards other people's well-being, and self-care, which recognizes that you can't take care of anyone else if you don't take care of yourself first. As we walked back toward the condos hand in hand under a sky full of stars, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged entirely to me, not a marriage that required constant compromise, not a family role that demanded endless service, not a living situation that depended on other people's tolerance of my presence. I was building a life that made me happy, and I was sharing it with someone who valued my happiness as much as I was learning to value it myself. The trust money would become available in 3 days, the condo purchase would close the following week, and my new life would officially begin. But in many ways, it had already begun the moment I'd chosen to put myself first for once in my 64 years. As we reached my door, Jim kissed me goodnight, a gentle, respectful kiss that held the promise of possibility without demanding anything I wasn't ready to give. Sweet dreams, Margaret, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a beautiful day. Standing on my lanai after he left, listening to the waves and feeling the warm breeze carry the scent of plumeria and possibility, I knew he was right. Tomorrow was going to be beautiful, and so was the day after that and the day after that. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, and it was everything Jack had hoped it would be. The trust funds transferred into my account on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and bright, with dolphins dancing in the waves beyond my lanai as if celebrating this milestone with me. I stared at the bank balance on my phone screen, $1.2 million, that represented not just financial security, but the validation of every choice I'd made since leaving Chicago. Jack had known this day would come, had planned for it with the same careful attention he'd given to everything that mattered to him. I was still processing the reality of my newfound independence when my phone rang with a call that would change everything. Mrs. Patterson. This is Detective Rodriguez with the Chicago Police Department. I'm calling about your son, David Patterson. My blood turned to ice water. Is he hurt? Has there been an accident? No, ma'am, he's not injured, but he's been arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud related to his employment at Morrison Technologies. He's asking for you to contact his attorney and, if possible, to come back to Chicago to help with his defense. The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through a rushing sound in my ears that made it hard to concentrate. David, my responsible, rule-following son, who had never so much as gotten a speeding ticket, was in jail. I don't understand. The woman who called me last week said it was just some personal expenses on company cards, nothing criminal. Ma'am, the investigation has expanded significantly since then. We're looking at potentially fraudulent expense reports going back over 2 years, falsified timesheets, and possible kickbacks from vendors. The amounts we're talking about are substantial, over $60,000 in questionable transactions. $60,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the magnitude, but because of what it represented. David hadn't just made a few desperate mistakes in the weeks since I'd left. He'd been engaging in systematic fraud for years, long before my departure had created any household crisis. After I hung up with Detective Rodriguez, I sat on my lanai in stunned silence, watching the waves roll in with their eternal rhythm while my mind tried to process this new reality. The son I'd raised to value honesty above all else, who had lectured his own children about the importance of integrity, had been stealing from his employer for 2 years. My first instinct was to pack immediately to fly back to Chicago and somehow fix this catastrophe through sheer force of maternal will. But as I sat there with the Hawaiian trade winds carrying the scent of plumeria and possibility, I found myself asking the same question that had guided me through the past month. Was David's crisis really my emergency? Helen found me there an hour later, still staring at the ocean with tears streaming down my face. Oh, honey, what's happened? I told her about the call about David's arrest and the scope of the charges against him. Helen listened without judgment, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy until I finished with the question that was tearing me apart. He's my son, Helen. How can I stay here knowing he's in jail, knowing he needs help? What kind of help does he need that you're uniquely qualified to provide? The question was so practical, so direct that it cut through the emotional fog clouding my thinking. I don't know. Money for a lawyer, maybe. Support during the trial. Does he not have access to money for a lawyer? What about his house, the one you paid off for him? He could probably get a home equity loan. And what about emotional support? Does he not have a wife? Friends, other family members who could provide that? I stared at her, beginning to understand the point she was making. David was a 42-year-old man with resources and relationships of his own. The crisis he was facing, while devastating, was not something that required my specific intervention to resolve. But I'm his mother. Shouldn't I? You're his mother, not his savior. There's a difference. Helen's voice was gentle but firm. Margaret, you've spent your entire adult life rushing to fix other people's problems, often before they even asked for your help. What would happen if just once you let someone figure out their own solution? What would happen indeed? The question followed me through the rest of that day as I struggled with the competing demands of maternal instinct and hard-won self-preservation. Every fiber of my being screamed that good mothers don't abandon their children in times of crisis, but a quieter voice, one that sounded suspiciously like Jack's, whispered that good mothers also don't enable destructive behavior by constantly swooping in to minimize consequences. By evening, I'd made my decision. I called David's attorney, a man named Kenneth Walsh, who specialized in white-collar criminal defense, and arranged to wire $20,000 to his retainer account. It was more than enough to ensure David would have excellent legal representation, but not so much that I was bankrupting myself to solve a problem I hadn't created. Then I called David himself. The conversation was one of the most difficult of my life. David was in the county jail awaiting a bail hearing, and he sounded smaller and more frightened than I'd heard him since he was a little boy. Mom, thank God. I've been going crazy thinking you wouldn't find out until it was too late to help. I've arranged for your legal fees to be covered, I said without preamble. Mr. Walsh is supposed to be one of the best criminal defense attorneys in Chicago. Legal fees. Mom, I need you here. I need you to help me figure out how to handle Melissa and the kids, how to manage the house, how to deal with all the practical stuff while I'm fighting this case. The same old pattern, David in crisis expecting me to drop everything and fix the collateral damage his choices had created. But sitting in my beautiful Hawaiian condo looking out at an ocean that had become my sanctuary, I felt something I'd never felt before when one of my children was in troubled attachment. David, you're going to have to figure those things out yourself, or with help from people who choose to give it. I'm not coming back to Chicago. The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had been disconnected. When David finally spoke, his voice was incredulous. Not coming back, Mom. I'm facing felony charges. I could go to prison. My career is over. My reputation is destroyed, and you're telling me you won't even come home to help me through this. I'm telling you that I'm not responsible for fixing the consequences of choices you made long before I left Chicago. David, you've been stealing from your employer for 2 years. This isn't something that happened because I wasn't there to keep you on the right path. This is something you chose to do while I was there cooking your meals and cleaning your house and babysitting your children. I didn't steal anything. I made some mistakes with expense reports, maybe took some liberties with the company credit card, but I always intended to pay it back. The rationalization was so complete, so divorced from reality, that I barely recognized my son in it. This was the voice of someone who had convinced himself that systematic fraud was just a series of minor mistakes, that intentions mattered more than actions. David, listen to me. I love you. I will always love you. But I can't save you from this, and more importantly, I shouldn't save you from this. You made choices that have consequences, and those consequences belong to you. This is unbelievable. My own mother is abandoning me when I need her most. I'm not abandoning you. I'm refusing to enable you. There's a difference. The conversation devolved from there, with David alternating between rage and manipulation, trying every emotional lever he could find to convince me to return to Chicago and resume my role as the family problem solver. But each attempt only strengthened my resolve. This was exactly the kind of crisis I'd been unconsciously preventing by managing everyone's life for them, and my absence had revealed the depth of dysfunction I'd been enabling through my constant intervention. After I hung up, I called Emma and Jake to explain in age-appropriate terms that their father was having some legal troubles and that I wouldn't be able to visit for a while. Their innocent questions broke my heart. Why couldn't Daddy just say he was sorry and make things better? When would Grandma come see them? But their resilience also reminded me that children adapt to circumstances much better than adults give them credit for. The next few weeks brought a steady stream of updates from Chicago, most of them designed to make me feel guilty for not returning to handle the crisis personally. Melissa called daily with reports of her overwhelming stress, her inability to cope the children's behavioral problems in response to their father's absence, and their grandmother's continued abandonment. "Margaret, I'm drowning here," she sobbed during one particularly dramatic call. "David's bail hearing is next week, and I don't know how to prepare for it. The kids are asking questions I don't know how to answer. The house is falling apart. I'm behind on everything at work, and I can't do this alone." "You're not alone, Melissa. You have parents, siblings, friends. Ask them for help." "It's not the same. We need family, not outsiders." "Then ask David's brothers and sisters for help. Ask your parents to come stay for a few weeks. Build the support network you should have been building all along, instead of depending on one person to handle everything." But even as I gave this advice, I could hear in Melissa's voice that she wasn't really listening. She was waiting for me to crack, to feel so guilty about the chaos my absence was creating that I'd abandon my new life and return to solve everyone's problems. The breakthrough came during a call with Emma, who was staying with Melissa's parents, while the legal crisis unfolded. Grandma Mommy cries a lot now, she said with the matter-of-fact tone children use to report important information. She says it's because you won't come home to help us. What do you think, sweetheart? I think Mommy doesn't know how to do the things you used to do, like cooking dinner that tastes good, or remembering which days are library days, or making the house not messy. Out of the mouths of babes, Emma had identified the real issue with perfect clarity. This wasn't about my abandonment. It was about learned helplessness. I'd been managing so many aspects of their daily life that the adults in the family had never learned to manage those things themselves. Do you think your mommy could learn how to do those things? Maybe. Grandpa's been helping her with cooking, and Grandma bought her a calendar to write everything down on. But she says it's too hard and she doesn't want to do it. There it was, the truth a 7-year-old could see, but the adults couldn't. Melissa was capable of learning to manage her own household, but she found it easier to blame me for not being there to do it for her than to adapt to changed circumstances. Emma, I want you to know that I love you very much, and I'm not staying away because I don't want to be with you. I'm staying away because I'm learning how to be happy, and I think it's important for grown-ups to know how to be happy. Are you happy there, Grandma? Very happy, sweetheart. Then I think you should stay. Daddy always says we should make choices that are good for us, even when other people don't like those choices. The wisdom of innocence. Even facing the trauma of her father's legal troubles and her mother's emotional breakdown, Emma could understand that my happiness mattered and that it wasn't her responsibility to sacrifice myself to make other people's lives easier. That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with the crisis in Chicago. Instead of feeling guilty about the chaos my absence had created, I began to see it as a necessary adjustment period, like a physical therapist who removes a patient's crutches to force them to strengthen their own muscles. My departure was forcing my family to develop capabilities they'd never needed while I was handling everything for them. The reports from Chicago gradually became less frantic and more pragmatic. David made bail and was living in a studio apartment while awaiting trial, his house having been put up for sale to pay legal fees. Melissa had hired a housekeeper and enrolled the children in an after-school program that provided the structure and supervision they needed. She'd also started seeing a therapist to deal with her anxiety about managing responsibilities she'd never had to handle before. Most importantly, the extended family had rallied in ways that might never have happened if I'd been there to serve as the primary support system. David's sister flew in from Denver to help with the children during particularly difficult weeks. Melissa's parents took Emma and Jake for extended visits when court dates and lawyer meetings made normal routine impossible. Friends from the neighborhood organized meal trains and carpool schedules. A support network was emerging organically built on reciprocal relationships and shared responsibility rather than the one person does everything model I'd been unconsciously maintaining for years. Meanwhile, my own life in Hawaii was blossoming in ways I'd never imagined possible. The condo purchase had closed smoothly, and I'd spent weeks making the space truly mine, hanging artwork I'd chosen because I liked it, not because it matched someone else's decorating scheme, arranging furniture to maximize the ocean view, creating a small garden on the extended lanai where I could grow herbs and flowers that thrived in the tropical climate. I'd joined Helen's book club, a group of 8 women who met monthly to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary memoirs, often with the kind of spirited debates that reminded me how much I'd missed intellectual stimulation. I'd also started volunteering at the local literacy center, helping adult learners improve their reading skills work that felt meaningful and purposeful without being demanded or expected. But perhaps the most surprising development was the deepening of my relationship with Jim. What had started as friendship based on shared interests had evolved into something that felt like partnership. We weren't rushing into anything dramatic. Neither of us was interested in remarrying or combining households, but we were building something real and substantial. We took long walks on the beach every morning talking about books and politics and philosophy with the kind of easy intimacy that comes from genuinely enjoying each other's company. We cooked dinner together several times a week, sharing meals that were leisurely and conversation filled rather than rushed obligations to be gotten through as efficiently as possible. We explored the island together, discovering hidden beaches and local festivals and small towns where we could spend entire afternoons just wandering and observing. Most remarkably, Jim treated me like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered independent of what I could do for him. He was interested in my opinions about everything from current events to restaurant choices. He consulted me about decisions that affected our shared activities. He noticed when I was tired or stressed or particularly happy about something, and he responded to those observations with genuine care rather than expecting me to manage my own emotional state so it wouldn't inconvenience him. "You know what I love most about being with you," he said one evening as we sat on my lanai, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "What? You're not trying to take care of me. You're not anticipating needs I haven't expressed or solving problems I haven't asked you to solve. You're just present. It's the most relaxing relationship I've ever had." The observation hit me with unexpected force because it highlighted something I hadn't fully realized about my previous patterns. In my marriage to Jack, in my relationships with my children, in my 4 years with David and Melissa's family, I'd been constantly vigilant for signs that someone needed something from me. I'd trained myself to be hyper aware of other people's moods and needs, to anticipate problems before they became crises, to smooth over conflicts before they could escalate. With Jim, I was learning to simply be present without being responsible. It was a revelation. 3 months after David's arrest, I received a call that brought the first genuinely good news from Chicago in weeks. "Margaret, it's Kenneth Walsh, David's attorney. I wanted to update you on recent developments in the case." I held my breath, preparing for more bad news. "The prosecution has offered a plea deal that we're strongly recommending David accept. He'd plead guilty to a reduced charge of misuse of company funds, serve 6 months in minimum security prison, pay full restitution, and be on probation for 2 years. It's a much better outcome than we could have hoped for given the original charges." 6 months in prison. It seemed like both a significant punishment and a merciful resolution to what could have been a much more serious situation. How does David feel about the offer? Initially resistant, but I think he's beginning to understand that taking responsibility and accepting consequences is his best path forward. He's also been required to attend financial counseling and anger management as part of the pre-sentencing agreement, and those sessions seem to be helping him understand how his choices created this situation. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time processing this news and what it meant for my relationship with my son. David was finally being forced to confront the consequences of his actions without anyone swooping in to fix things for him. It was painful to witness, but also necessary for his development as a person who took responsibility for his own choices. That evening, I called David directly for the first time since our conversation when he was first arrested. "Mom." His voice was different, smaller, more uncertain, but also clearer somehow, as if some fog had lifted. "I heard about the plea offer. How are you feeling about it?" "Scared, ashamed, but also relieved, I guess. The uncertainty was killing me, and at least now I know what I'm facing." We talked for almost an hour, and for the first time in months, it felt like a real conversation between two adults rather than a manipulation session designed to get me to return to Chicago. David told me about the counseling sessions, about the financial planning classes he'd been required to attend, about his growing understanding of how his sense of entitlement had led to increasingly serious ethical compromises. I kept telling myself I deserved those things, The expensive dinners, the services to make life easier, the shortcuts that saved me time and effort. I felt like I was working so hard that the company owed me more than they were giving me. What do you think changed that perspective? Losing everything, I guess. Sitting in jail knowing I could lose my family and my freedom made me realize how much I'd been taking for granted. And the counseling helped me see that I'd been doing the same thing with you, taking your contributions for granted because I felt entitled to them. It was the first time David had explicitly acknowledged that my decision to leave had been justified, and the admission meant more to me than any apology could have. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for treating you like hired help, for expecting you to sacrifice your own happiness to make our lives easier, for getting angry when you finally chose yourself. You deserved better from all of us. The apology was everything I'd hoped for and had never expected to receive. But more than that, it represented genuine understanding rather than just strategic remorse designed to get me to return to my old role. I forgive you, David, and I'm proud of you for taking responsibility and working to understand how you got to this point. Does this mean you'll come back? The kids miss you terribly, and I know Melissa would love to have another chance to show you how much she appreciates what you did for us. The question I'd been dreading asked with hope rather than manipulation was somehow even harder to answer than the angry demands had been. I'm not coming back to live in Chicago, David, but I'd like to start visiting regularly, maybe having Emma and Jake come stay with me here during school breaks. I want to be part of your lives, but as a grandmother and mother who's chosen and appreciated, not as a default problem solver who's expected and taken for granted. I understand, he said, and I could hear that he really did. It'll take some time to rebuild trust, won't it? Yes, it will. But I think we can do it if we're both committed to treating each other as people with valid needs and boundaries rather than just family roles to be filled. After we hung up, I walked out onto my lanai and looked at the ocean where a pod of dolphins was playing in the waves about 50 yards from shore. Jack had always said dolphins were good luck, a sign that you were exactly where you belonged. For the first time since leaving Chicago, I felt like my family crisis was truly resolved, not because the problems had been fixed, but because everyone involved was finally taking responsibility for their own lives and choices. David would serve his sentence and rebuild his career with the knowledge that his actions had consequences. Melissa would continue developing the life management skills she'd never learned because I'd been handling everything for her. Emma and Jake would grow up understanding that love doesn't require self-sacrifice, that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect rather than exploitation. And I would continue building a life that made me happy, secure in the knowledge that I'd finally learned the difference between loving people and enabling them, between being helpful and being indispensable. Jim joined me on the lanai as the sun was setting, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the easy smile that had become one of my favorite sights in the world. Good news from Chicago, he asked, settling into the chair beside mine. The best kind of news, I said, the kind where everyone involved is finally growing up. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and the sky explode into colors that never got old. Somewhere in Chicago, my family was learning to function without my constant intervention. Here in Hawaii, I was learning to function as a complete person rather than just a collection of services provided to others. It had taken me 64 years to discover what it felt like to choose myself, but sitting there with the warm breeze carrying the scent of plumeria and possibility, watching dolphins play in the waves, while the man I was falling in love with shared the silence beside me, I knew it had been worth the wait. The greatest revenge, I realized, wasn't making the people who'd hurt me suffer. It was becoming so happy they could no longer diminish my joy. The first year of my new life unfolded like a flower blooming in slow motion, each month bringing revelations about who I was when I wasn't defined by other people's needs. By the time the anniversary of my great escape rolled around, I barely recognized the woman who had once set her alarm for 3 a.m. to cook for people who never thanked her. I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop in Lahaina, reading the morning paper and enjoying the kind of leisurely breakfast that had become my new normal when my phone buzzed with a text from Emma that would change everything. "Grandma, can you FaceTime? I have something important to tell you." Her excitement was contagious even through the screen, and when her face appeared on my phone, she was practically bouncing with anticipation. "Guess what, Grandma, Mom, and Dad are getting a divorce." The announcement hit me like a cold wave, even though I'd been expecting it for months. The stress of David's legal troubles combined with the revelation of deeper financial and emotional problems in their marriage had been building toward this inevitable conclusion. "How do you feel about that, sweetheart?" "I think it's good," Emma said with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "They fight all the time now, and it makes the house feel scary. Mom says we might move to Grandma and Grandpa's house in Springfield, and Dad says he's going to get a small apartment near us so he can still see us lots." "And Jake, how's he handling the news?" "He's sad, but he's also excited because Dad promised we could help decorate his new apartment, and Mom says we can get a puppy when we move to Springfield because Grandma and Grandpa have a big yard." The resilience of children never ceased to amaze me. While the adults in their lives were consumed with the drama and logistics of divorce, Emma and Jake were already adapting to the new reality and finding silver linings in the chaos. That evening, I called David to get the adult perspective on the situation. "Mom, I wanted you to hear it from me before someone else told you," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Melissa and I are separating. The divorce should be final by the end of the year." "I'm sorry, David. I know this must be incredibly difficult. Honestly, it's a relief. We've been holding on to something that died years ago, staying together out of habit and fear rather than love or compatibility. The legal troubles just forced us to finally face what we'd been avoiding." David sounded different, older, wiser, less entitled than the man who had showed up at my door in Hawaii 18 months earlier, demanding that I return to manage his crisis. Prison had been transformative in ways I never would have expected, forcing him to confront not just his financial crimes, but the deeper patterns of entitlement and avoidance that had led to them. "What will you do now?" "I'm starting over, basically. New job, a much humbler position than I had before, but honest work with a company that was willing to hire someone with my background. Small apartment in a neighborhood where I can walk to Emma and Jake's school. Simple life focused on being the kind of father they deserve instead of the kind of provider I thought I needed to be." The transformation in David's perspective was remarkable. The man who had once defined his worth through his job title and salary was now talking about success in terms of relationships and personal integrity. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said when I visited you in Hawaii," he continued, "about the difference between being needed and being appreciated. I spent so many years assuming that if I could just make enough money and provide enough material comfort, my family would automatically be happy. I never learned how to actually be present with the people I loved. And now I'm learning. It's harder than I thought it would be, being emotionally available instead of just financially responsible. But it's also more rewarding." Emma and I had a 2-hour conversation yesterday about her art project, and Jake and I spent Saturday morning just throwing a football in the park. Simple stuff, but it felt more meaningful than all the expensive vacations and elaborate birthday parties I used to plan. As I listened to David describe his new approach to fatherhood, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that he had learned to prioritize relationships over achievements, sadness that it had taken a felony conviction, and the destruction of his marriage to teach him lessons I'd been trying to model his entire life. "What about Melissa? How is she handling the separation?" "Better than I expected, actually. I think she's been as miserable as I have for the past few years. But neither of us wanted to admit it. She's excited about moving back to Springfield, being closer to her parents, starting fresh in a place where she doesn't have to pretend our marriage was perfect. And the children, they'll spend weekdays with Melissa and weekends with me, plus Wednesday dinners and extended time during school breaks. We're committed to putting their needs first, which is something we probably should have been doing all along instead of using them as bargaining chips in our adult conflicts." The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, I felt like I was talking to the son I'd raised rather than the entitled man he'd become during his years of material success. Prison had stripped away the superficial markers of achievement that had been masking deeper problems, forcing him to rebuild his identity around character rather than status. 2 weeks later, I received an even more surprising call from Melissa. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling. I know things have been complicated between us. Of course I don't mind. How are you doing with everything? Honestly, I'm terrified, but also more hopeful than I've been in years. The marriage had been over for a long time. We were just too stubborn or scared to admit it. Now that we're finally facing reality, I can start building the life I actually want instead of the one I thought I was supposed to want. Melissa sounded different too, less polished, more genuine, as if the pressure of maintaining perfect appearances had finally become too exhausting to sustain. I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you when you lived with us. I've been in therapy for the past year dealing with my anxiety and control issues, and I'm beginning to understand how much damage I did by taking your contributions for granted while demanding that you be grateful for the privilege of serving us. The apology was more comprehensive than anything she'd offered during her desperate visit to Hawaii, and it felt genuine rather than strategic. I appreciate that, Melissa. It takes courage to look honestly at our own behavior. The therapist has been helping me understand that I was so focused on creating the appearance of a perfect family that I lost sight of what actually makes families healthy. I thought that if everything looked right from the outside, beautiful house, well-behaved children, elaborate holiday celebrations, then we must be doing something right. But I never learned how to create genuine connection or emotional intimacy. What does that look like now as you're starting over? Simpler mostly. Emma and I bake cookies together on Sunday afternoons just because we enjoy it, not because I need Instagram-worthy content. Jake and I have started reading together before bedtime chapter books that we discuss and laugh about. I'm learning to pay attention to what they actually enjoy instead of what I think they should enjoy. The transformation in both David and Melissa was remarkable, but it also highlighted something that took me longer to process: the role my own enabling had played in preventing this growth. By managing so many aspects of their lives, by smoothing over conflicts before they could be resolved, by providing services that prevented them from learning essential life skills, I had inadvertently stunted their emotional development. My departure hadn't just freed me to discover my own happiness, it had forced them to develop capabilities they'd never needed while I was handling everything for them. This realization crystallized during a conversation with Helen as we walked on the beach one morning discussing the latest updates from Chicago. "Do you think I was wrong to leave when I did?" I asked her. "Maybe if I'd stayed and tried to work things out differently, I could have helped them address these problems without everything falling apart so dramatically." Helen stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression serious but kind. "Margaret, what makes you think it was your job to prevent them from experiencing the consequences of their own choices? I'm their mother. I'm supposed to protect them." "You're supposed to protect your children from dangers they can't handle themselves." David was a 42-year-old man making deliberate choices to commit fraud. Melissa was a 38-year-old woman choosing to treat you like hired help while taking credit for the household management you were actually doing. Those weren't situations where your protection would have been helpful. They were situations where your intervention was preventing necessary growth. As we resumed walking, Helen continued her gentle but firm analysis. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to shield them from reality. Your family needed to learn that actions have consequences, that relationships require reciprocity, that emotional maturity can't be outsourced to other people. They couldn't learn those lessons while you were managing their lives for them." The wisdom in her words settled into my bones, like warmth from the morning sun. I hadn't abandoned my family, I'd stopped enabling their dysfunction. I hadn't caused their problems. I'd stopped preventing them from facing problems they needed to solve. 6 months later, Emma and Jake came to visit me in Hawaii for their spring break, their first extended stay since I'd left Chicago. The week we spent together was a revelation for all of us. Without the constant chaos of their parents' failing marriage, without the pressure to maintain appearances or meet unrealistic expectations, the children blossomed into the funny, curious, creative individuals they'd always been beneath the stress of their family situation. Emma spent hours on my lanai painting watercolors of the ocean and the tropical flowers in my garden, talking about her art classes and her dreams of becoming an illustrator. Jake discovered a love for snorkeling, spending entire afternoons exploring the coral reefs near my condo with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. But perhaps most importantly, they got to see their grandmother as a complete person rather than just a service provider. They met Jim, who charmed them with his knowledge of marine biology and his willingness to build elaborate sandcastles. They accompanied me to book club where they were welcomed by my friends and treated as interesting people rather than inconveniences to be managed. They saw me pursuing my own interests, making my own choices, living a life that was mine rather than existing solely to serve others. "Grandma, you seem different here," Emma observed one evening as we sat on the lanai watching the sunset. "Happier, I guess." "How did I seem different in Chicago?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important topics. "In Chicago, you always looked worried, like you were thinking about all the things you needed to do for other people. Here you look. Peaceful, like you're thinking about things you want to do for yourself." The observation was so perceptive it took my breath away. This 7-year-old had identified something I'd been struggling to articulate: the difference between existing for others and living for yourself. "Do you think it's selfish for grown-ups to do things that make them happy?" I asked her. "Only if they're mean to other people while they're doing it." "But you're not mean to anybody. You're just happy. And when you're happy, it makes me happy too." Jake, who had been building with Legos while listening to our conversation, looked up to add his perspective. "In Chicago, everybody was always mad about something. Here, nobody's mad. I like it better when nobody's mad." The children's insights were profound in their simplicity. They'd been living in an atmosphere of chronic stress and conflict, surrounded by adults who were too busy managing crises to model genuine contentment or joy. Here in Hawaii, they were seeing what healthy adult relationships looked like, what it meant to choose happiness rather than just endure responsibility. On their last night, as I was tucking them into the guest room I'd prepared with bright tropical bedding and books chosen specifically for their interests, Jake asked the question that had been building all week. "Grandma, are you ever going to move back to Chicago?" "No, sweetheart, this is my home now. But what if we miss you too much? Then you'll visit me here, and I'll visit you there, and we'll talk on the phone and send pictures and letters. Missing people is okay, it means we love them. But love doesn't mean we have to live in the same place or see each other every day." Emma, always the philosopher, added her own perspective. "It's like when I'm at school and I miss Mommy, but I still like school. I can miss you and still be happy that you live somewhere that makes you happy." And the next morning, as I watched their plane disappear into the clouds, carrying them back to their new life in Springfield with Melissa and her parents, I felt the familiar pang of missing them mixed with something new, pride in the resilience and wisdom they were developing. That evening, Jim found me on the beach, walking alone in the moonlight and processing the emotions of the week. "How are you feeling about them leaving?" he asked, falling into step beside me. "Sad to see them go, but not guilty about staying. That's progress, I think." "Definitely progress. You've given them something invaluable this week, a model of what it looks like for an adult to choose happiness without hurting other people in the process." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the waves and watching the stars reflect in the water. Finally, Jim spoke again. "Margaret, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Something in his tone made me stop walking and turn to face him. In the moonlight, I could see that he was nervous, fidgeting with something in his pocket. I know we've both been hesitant about making big commitments, given our histories and our ages and the independence we've both worked so hard to establish. My heart began to race as I realized where this conversation might be heading. But this past year and a half with you has been the happiest of my life, not because you take care of me or because I take care of you, but because we take care of each other, because we've built something based on choice rather than obligation, on compatibility rather than convenience. He pulled a small box from his pocket, and I gasped despite myself. I'm not asking you to marry me, he said quickly. I know marriage carries too much historical baggage for both of us, but I'm asking if you'll make a formal commitment to building this life together, to choosing each other every day, to supporting each other's dreams, to growing old together as partners, rather than just friends. He opened the box to reveal not a traditional engagement ring, but a beautiful piece of jewelry that was uniquely us, a pendant, shaped like a wave set with a small diamond that caught the moonlight like captured starlight. It's a commitment pendant, he explained, something that represents our choice to be together without the legal or social expectations that come with traditional marriage. I stared at the pendant, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Jim had understood without my having to explain that I needed a symbol of commitment that didn't carry the weight of previous definitions, that honored what we were building without forcing it into pre-existing categories. Yes, I whispered, then said it louder. Yes, I would love that. As he fastened the pendant around my neck, I felt something settle into place. Not the heavy burden of new obligations, but the light joy of chosen partnership. 2 years later, as I write this story from the lanai of the home Jim and I now share, watching dolphins play in the waves while he tends the garden we've planted together, I'm struck by how completely my life has transformed. David has rebuilt his career and his relationship with his children, becoming the present, emotionally available father he'd never learned to be during his years of chasing material success. He visits Hawaii twice a year, bringing Emma and Jake for adventures that have become the highlights of everyone's calendar. Melissa has found her footing as a single mother, developing the life management skills she'd never needed while I was handling everything for her. She started a small business, created genuine friendships in Springfield, and learned to find joy in simple family moments rather than elaborate productions designed to impress others. Emma and Jake are thriving in their new life, splitting time between parents who are finally emotionally available and building their own relationship with a grandmother who loves them without reservation, but doesn't sacrifice herself to prove it. Most remarkably, my relationship with my family has become stronger than it ever was when I was living to serve them. Because our interactions are now voluntary rather than obligatory, because I'm appreciated rather than expected, because I'm seen as a person rather than just a resource, every conversation feels like a gift rather than a duty. Helen often joins Jim and me for dinner, bringing her latest book recommendations and stories from the Literacy Center where we all volunteer. The book club has become a cornerstone of our social life, introducing us to new perspectives and challenging us to keep growing intellectually even in our retirement years. But perhaps the most profound change is in my relationship with myself. For the first time in my 66 years, I wake up each morning and decide how to spend my day based on what would bring me joy, rather than what would make me useful to others. Some days that means adventurous activities, snorkeling or hiking, or exploring a new part of the island. Other days it means quiet pleasures, reading on the lanai, tending my garden, having long conversations with Jim about everything and nothing. The trust money Jack left me has grown through careful investment, ensuring that I'll never again be dependent on anyone else's generosity or tolerance. But more importantly, I've learned that true security comes not from money, but from the knowledge that you can choose happiness even when that choice disappoints other people. Sometimes I think about the woman I was 3 years ago, the woman who set her alarm for 3 a.m. to cook for people who never thanked her, who gave away her life savings to buy acceptance from family members who took her sacrifice for granted, who measured her worth entirely through her utility to others. That woman seems like someone I knew long ago, someone I feel compassion for, but can barely recognize as myself. The transformation hasn't always been easy. There were moments of doubt, periods of guilt, times when the voice of old programming tried to convince me that choosing myself was selfish and wrong. But sitting here in paradise, literally and figuratively, watching the sun set over an ocean that has become my sanctuary while the man I love tends the garden we planted together, I know that Jack was right when he planned this escape route for me. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the courage to become the person you are meant to be, even when they can't see it as a gift at the time. The best revenge I've learned isn't making the people who hurt you suffer, it's becoming so genuinely happy that their opinions can no longer diminish your joy. It's choosing love without enabling dysfunction, offering care without accepting exploitation, maintaining family relationships without sacrificing your own well being. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky and Jim joins me on the lanai with 2 glasses of wine, I raise my glass in a silent toast to the woman who was brave enough to pack a suitcase and choose herself, and to the man who loved her enough to give her that choice even after death. At 66, I've finally learned that happiness isn't selfish, it's essential. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is show the people around you what it looks like to choose joy, to prioritize your own well being, to build a life that makes you genuinely excited to wake up each morning. The waves continue their eternal rhythm beyond my lanai, and I fall asleep each night to the sound of possibility washing up on the shore of the life I chose for myself.